All right, hi everyone. Welcome to our presentation on open source software research in India, Kenya, Egypt, and Mexico. My name is Mala, and I'm the Director of Tech for Social Good on the GitHub Social Impact team. And before I do anything else, I want to give a big shout out to the rest of the team, including my colleague Camaley, who's a comms and partnership specialist. She works with our team, and she's joining me today for our presentation alongside Priyanka Pathak, who's the principal of Samaj Studio, and Gina, Assaf, who's the Managing Director of OBI Digital Solutions. Welcome, and thank you all so much for being here today. So for those of you who aren't familiar, GitHub Tech for Social Good is a portfolio of programs on the social impact team whose primary purpose is to focus on open source capacity building for what we call the social sector. Now, we define the social sector as any organization or company, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, whose primary purpose is to work on the sustainable development goals. You can read more about our work at socialimpact.github.com, and be sure to check out the Tech for Social Good page to learn about our programs, and our Insights page to read about our blog posts, to access our research, and to see our previous talks. Now, one of the core things that we do at Tech for Social Good is research, and in 2019 and 2020, we conducted a large project on the intersection of open source software and the social sector. Now, while we had a lot of really amazing insights come out of the report, there are a couple of pieces that were especially relevant for the work that you'll hear about in just a few minutes. The first is that contributor growth on GitHub outside of the USA, Canada, Europe, and Australia has increased almost exponentially in the past couple of years. We also found out that public health and civic tech are social sector drivers in open source. We also found out differences of what we call consumption and production in open source software for the social sector, as well as the fact that there are sometimes unclear incentives in contributing to open source for the social sector. We also found out that funding, writ large, for the social sector, not just for open source, tends to go to new software instead of to existing software, and you'll hear some of these themes throughout the presentation today. Now, our first research project in 2019 focused a lot on open source that was either created or maintained here in the United States and in Europe. So for this one, we wanted to differentiate that. And what we ended up deciding was to go for something called low and middle income countries, or LMICs for short. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, LMICs is essentially how much money the average person in a country makes and the classification with that. The reason that we decided to focus on LMICs is because in 2019 we had an expert convening of practitioners who work on open source in the social sector. And so we asked them, what are the driving factors for people who contribute to open source in the social sector? And almost unanimously, the top reason they said was income level. And so we knew that focusing on LMICs would yield different insights than our previous research, but we weren't exactly sure how or why. So there's obviously a lot of low and middle income countries in the world, and so to narrow down the list, we decided to start with the long list of countries that we know to have high or medium tech maturity. And from there, we looked at 5 major criteria, including relevant connections in the country, relevant ecosystems in the country, and then of course, because it's still tough for us to go in person and do the research, the ability to connect remotely. So we did a weighted score for GitHub and for OBI. We merged the scores, and from the title of the presentation, you can probably guess that the 4 countries we selected were India, Kenya, Egypt, and Mexico. We're really excited about these countries, not just for the language and the geographic diversity, but for the fact that working globally in tech for social good, we know that these countries have very different tech ecosystems and tech maturities. Now, the United Nations is one of the key stakeholders in our work, and last month I had the chance to participate in the United Nations General Assembly side event, during which Salam Ivan, who's the director of the Global Services Division of UN OICT, referred to these 4 countries as key and interesting for the United Nations, so it was really great to get that feedback. To date, we've done 53 interviews across the 4 countries, and we've also had 578 survey responses in English, Spanish, and Arabic. Now, we use these surveys primarily to source interviewees, but we will also use them as a kind of a synthesis as a research input. Now, it is important to note that at this stage, we are still in the synthesis of our work, and so some of the insights that you hear may change, and we'll talk about how to get involved in the direction of the overall research later in the presentation. So with that, I'll pass it over to Camaley to talk about tech ecosystems and OSS development. Over to you, Camaley.
Great. Thanks, Mala. As she mentioned, I'll be discussing our first theme, which is tech ecosystems and OSS development. So diving right in, we found that both the tech sector and the social sector are drivers to when and how a country has adopted and continues to grow social impact, OSS, shaping its use and production. So starting with a bit of context, the concept of OSS began in the 1970s and 1980s in the US, stemming from a moral perspective to open software development for all, as well as a grassroots movement to disrupt the status quo of technology as we knew it during the time. Meaning, even though corporate tech companies drive most OSS, many people still associate open source software with academia and other non-commercial purposes. GNU was founded in the 1980s, and the Open Source Initiative was founded in 1998. Moving on to one of the 4 focus countries, India. One of the first booms in the tech industry in India was in the early 2000s. That boom was driven by business process outsourcing, like customer support call centers. The subsequent larger booms were largely driven by more sophisticated software development in the country. For example, the nonprofit Omanure divides software types into 3 eras. The last era is labeled as the commercial open source software, which they say started around in the 2010s and was driven by big commercial companies. Thus, it makes sense that there is a strong association of OSS and commercial tech in India. During the global recession in the 2010s, the tech space in India benefited during this time and grew its OS adoption rate immensely due to demands for inexpensive labor. Moving forward, year after year, more and more large private sector tech companies have continued to utilize OS. In fact, in relation to our other 3 countries discussed in this research, India has served as a catalyst for growth of OS and continues to do so today. So looking further, we've discovered that there are 3 main motivations for driving OSS in our 4 countries, which are academic roots in the democratization of technology, philanthropic perspective and a moral imperative, and lastly, economic drivers in the private sector, including free or low-cost labor. So moving deeper into these topics, for economic drivers, this motivation actually impacts all 4 countries, especially startups using OSS looking to cut costs. As discussed in the previous example in India, this has been a prominent defining factor. Take Robusta, for example. It's a full-service digital agency booming by leveraging OSS frameworks. In Egypt, the boom of OS adoption is happening now, building upon the low-cost model. Startups are leveraging OSS frameworks such as Laravel. Moving next to the academic drivers, similar to the US, Mexico has its OS roots in academia, notably civic data and the democratization of data. Tech communities across the country are embracing the philosophy of making government policies and information accessible to all. As for Kenya, DHIS2 is a prime example of its driver. DHIS2 is the district health information software, and it is used in more than 60 countries around the world. DHIS2 is an open source software platform for reporting, analysis, and the dissemination for data for all health programs. Or in other words, it's a country's health management system. Born out of the University of Oslo, the university backing this platform has helped to democratize this health data. Notably, Kenya was the first country to roll out DHIS2 nationally, and a major university in Kenya continues to work on this platform today. Lastly, I wanted to touch on the philanthropic motivations. As for Kenya, more and more companies are including OS and RFPs for social sector projects. One example is DIAL, or the Digital Impact Alliance, which is a part of the UN Foundation. They drive forward the principles of digital development. These are a set of 9 living guidelines that are designed to help integrate best practices into technology-enabled programs and are intended to be updated and refined over time. India is moving to include OS not only in the private, but also in the social sector, broadening its reach. Turning to the motivation from a local perspective, an executive from a local nonprofit called Sunburned has said, if you look at the background, the founders and funders come with a mindset and a strong belief in building technology for social good to make it open source, so people can build upon it and enhance it in giving a long-lasting impact to the world and improving the sustainable development goals. Another example from a tech influencer, Donald Lobo, who was part of the Indian diaspora, mentioned when speaking about the tech group he founded said, when we deliver something for NGOs, if we use prior work, we have to make it open source. Thank you, and now to speak further on community drivers of OS is Priyanka.
Thanks, Camaley. So Camaley gave a great overview of how the broader tech ecosystems impact open source in our 4 countries. So now I'm going to dive into the flip side and look from the ground up at some emerging trends within open source communities and LMICs. And as a note, when I say communities, I'm referring specifically to developer communities, although there is a whole other set of insights on user communities that we are also diving into. So the first pattern we've noticed is around circumventing economic limitations that developers have to contributing to open source. Unsurprisingly, despite booming open source tool usage around the world, software developers and LMICs often aren't able to afford to spend time contributing to open source projects pro bono. All their focus is, understandably, on making a living wage. However, despite this hurdle, open source communities in our 4 countries have found ways to motivate open source contribution all the same. So looking at some country examples, in India, we heard a lot about a cultural belief in giving back. A lot of interviewees really mentioned that, they had this really shared sense of morality that really motivated them to contribute time whenever possible towards open source development, even if it wasn't continuously. And then also in India, although this does apply to many of the other countries as well, working on open source software is known to sometimes lead to better jobs for people. And that alone serves as some motivation and incentives to participate. And student volunteers are especially keen to get involved in this space. In Mexico, an organization called CCOSS, which is focused on getting more Spanish-speaking developers to contribute to open source, they actively advocate for startups and tech companies to allocate time from their development teams to contribute back to the open source frameworks that they use. So they work to find ways to build open source contribution into the businesses themselves. And then lastly, in Kenya, foreign capital is actually what pays for a lot of Kenyan developers to work on open source tools, which for them reduces the economic barriers and allows these developers and the companies at large too to advocate for and educate others in Kenya on open source software. Now, another common theme across the 4 countries is around the different types of social structures that allow for external communities to influence the focus and trajectory of open source development in each country. So one big example of this is the diaspora community influence, and this occurs mostly via organized spaces, largely online, but also a little bit offline. And we've noticed this most prominently in Egypt and in India, where the diaspora communities for both these countries participate often in open source development communities online. So a big example is a group on Facebook called Egyptian Geeks, which has over 55,000 members online. And within it, you can hear, or you can see a lot of these open source influencers coming in and sharing a lot of their knowledge and their education back with other community members. Another example from India is the Tech for Good community, which is both online and offline, sort of a loose group of organizations that offer advice to local Indian nonprofits and also some developers. Yeah, they're another example of how diaspora members can participate in this space. Another example is ICT for development communities around the world, and they are able to influence the open source space primarily via their funding models that they have. So when I say the ICT for development community, I'm talking about the big organizations that we all know, the UNs, the World Banks, USAID, etc. In Kenya and in Mexico, most new open source development and community building around open source is funded by organizations and individuals that specialize in tech for social impact. So for example, USAID, among many others, is helping to fund a lot of anti-corruption and transparency tool development in Mexico, like the National Digital Platform. And in this way, the global Tech for Good community is strongly influential in setting the priorities and direction of open source products. Now, one more area of focus for many open source developer communities and LMICs is increasing the accessibility of open source tools, both for contribution as well as for use. And the concept of accessibility plays out in a variety of different ways. One way is around spoken language. So in Mexico, for example, a significant barrier to entry for Spanish-speaking developers is the fact that a lot of open source resources are primarily in English. And some of them maybe don't feel as comfortable with English. Some of them maybe aren't familiar with English at all. But there are organizations like CCOSS, which I mentioned earlier, as well as Mozilla Mexico. And these organizations are working hard to create resources in Spanish for all of these developers. But even beyond Spanish, they're also working on localizing tools and resources in indigenous languages to further reduce that spoken language diversity barrier. In India, we have the example of Kalam, which is an open source programming language that is entirely in Hindi, and it's actually gaining popularity across the country, which is really interesting. Spoken language presents itself in Egypt in yet a different way. Open source developers there are working to create UI tools that present Arabic text right to left in the way that it's usually written and read as, to make it easier for Arabic speakers to be able to engage with tools online. Another way that accessibility is promoted is through extensibility. So in India, for instance, some open source developer organizations like Sunbird have modularized a lot of their tools, creating a flexible set of options for a diverse population of Indian developers, allowing them to choose what works best for them. In Mexico, we have a sort of similar example, the National Digital Platform, which I mentioned earlier as an open source government transparency initiative. They have a marketplace that offers small task-based modules, and it's available for any government institution anywhere to download and use for themselves. And then the last way that accessibility plays out is through last mile delivery of open source software. That term, last mile delivery, is one that we heard specifically in India, and it essentially just refers to knocking down all the final barriers for populations to be able to use open source tools. So two examples of this. One is the Tech for Good community that I referred to earlier, but also an organization called Social TIC, TIC in Mexico. These are two examples of organizations that offer tailored tech advice and also create tools for nonprofit organizations working in all around the countries. And they still make sure that they're championing open source with these organizations. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Gina to talk a little bit about government influence.
Hello everyone, I am Gina and I will be covering the last section of our early insights from the research, which is around the government influence on OSS. We decided to prioritize the government work in OSS in our research as government and social sector are intertwined. And it was manageable as entities to look into the government of 4 countries and compare and contrast than it would have been in our first research project, which was more of a broad coverage of social sector OSS space. And Mala discussed that earlier. Based on our interviews and desk research, we found that the 4 countries all have some policy around usage and production of open source. And this may be because they all have a substantial tech sector, or at least a booming tech sector, which was part of the criteria for our selection of the 4 countries. As you can imagine, they also differ in the levels of enforcement or encouragement, and also how specific they are. Then also they differ in how they are adopted and implemented by government officials at national and subnational levels. So I'll be talking about some of the interesting findings on OSS policies or influences from each country government. Starting with the India government is the strongest of all 4 and likely pretty high compared worldwide, but we also saw a large opportunity for further growth. The Indian national government, along with invested parties such as Nandan Nilekani and Pramod Varma, who are successful tech entrepreneurs in India, have a coordinated effort for OSS and digital transformation with the government. There are several examples of these government OSS built or made products, such as Aadhaar, the unique national ID issuing system, which they developed using an open source stack, and many parts of it were made open source to be used by other national government systems, and also developed into a globally used OSS platform called Mozip. Then we also have tax ID system, GST, which has also been developed via OSS stack. And then we have Diksha, which is used for teaching and learning infrastructure tech in India. And this was built on the Sunbird platform, which is an OSS platform for education systems. And the government has also opened APIs to Diksha. There are several OSS policies which encourage the use of OSS and actually state that agencies must use OSS if equivalent to whatever is proprietary is found, and if not, they have to have a written explanation. It was also noted in the Meteor India report and others that there is much more room for growth given the India software developer talent base and the government needs. Government in general, however, is a big player in the OSS ecosystem in India, especially compared to the other 3 countries we looked at. A lot of the initial push came from advocates lobbying for open standards, and now we even see consulting groups dedicated to building OSS for government agencies. Also, an interesting use case in India is the usage of their own OSS repository platform, OpenForge, which is enforced at the federal level, but not yet used much by the states. The GitHub India team sees this as somewhat of an opportunity right now to explore as a partnership or beyond. Moving on to Kenya, the Kenyan government has a long history of utilizing OSS, and it all started with the DHIS2 health system, which you heard about in earlier sections by Camaley. Kenya was the first national rollout of DHIS2, and the partnership between the health ministry and the Kenyatta University helped bring it to life and led to successes. Also similar to India, the Ministry of ICT in their national plan has a recommendation to build on and use OSS tools in all agencies. But from what we've learned is that it greatly varies among ministries, and some don't use it at all. And the government still prefers proprietary software tools, especially when it comes to crucial infrastructure, such as security tools. Mexico has some national level government OSS work, and most of it is motivated by increasing government transparency. This work is mostly at the national level, is what we've heard, and it has yet been trickling down to the states and subnational level. We also learned while the government supported initiatives around data transparency, anti-corruption, and other civic impact projects, the government support will vary and depend on the administration in power. For example, we heard of some advancement made on this front by the Civic Data Lab under the last administration, and it has changed with this newer administration. And now to talk about Egypt, we hear a lot about proprietary software usage, mainly such as Microsoft, which is the big one, but we do see some movements towards OSS. There was a large partnership in 2012, 2013 with Microsoft, which caused some advocacy for OSS, stating a loss of opportunity for the Egyptian tech sector. Interestingly, and maybe directly related to the advocacy in Egypt, in 2014, they announced a national strategy to support OSS. And we heard of some movement there, but lacked visibility and not much write-ups about it. One area we think has influenced to a degree the open source software movement is the stringent data policy by the government, which, as we know, there is a relationship between open data and open software, and open data can be an impetus for more OSS. The stringent data obstacle has potentially slowed down progress on OSS in government space. Digital Egypt initiative by Ministry of ICT to digitize government services includes a big push for capacity building of the IT sector, and there is some indication of OSS components. So we see some opportunity for potential growth of OSS in the government of Egypt. And that covers our early insights from our research thus far, and I'll hand it off to Mala to wrap this up for us. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Gina, Priyanka, and Camaley for those insights. I've learned a lot through this research, and I can't wait for the final report to come out, which, speaking of, we anticipate will happen sometime in early 2022. If you want to get involved in the direction of the final research and other outputs, the best way to do that is through our research validation workshops, which we'll be hosting towards the end of November into early December. Now, we do ask that you sign up through this URL here, so I encourage everybody to take a screenshot and copy this down. Please sign up by Friday, November 12th. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at socialimpact@github.com. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.